The Russian Navy has been very centric on submarine, particularly nuclear submarine powers, and their confrontation with the West was always really underwater in the Atlantic, as I know very well. But in recent times, the Russians have become much more ambitious in the global stage, and their ambitions are now in Africa and the Far East, the Arctic, and increasingly in the Pacific. So, the aircraft carrier capability for them is deeply attractive, if at the moment too expensive, because the Russians have watched. They've recognized that having an aircraft carrier allows you to power project on the global stage like no other military asset.
The threat is changing. I mean, the satellite surveillance is now all pervasive, so hiding these things ever harder. The Chinese are investing an enormous amount of money in hypersonic precision missiles that will contribute to an anti-access area denial capability. So Jerry's made the point very powerfully that these ships remain the foundation stone of any credible modern blue water navy. But that can't be forever. There's too much investment going into being able to defeat carriers.
Russians who tried to replace their own Soviet-era naval surveillance satellite system with new constellations of Pion and Lotos electronic intelligence and electro-optical satellites had, by the early 2020s, only launched one electronic intelligence satellite and about 6 electro-optical ones. And Russia is itself a great military power. So I'd say the barriers to entry kind of preclude most states denying sea space to the aircraft carrier in the way that the Chinese can.
Hi, I'm James Heappey. Welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security on Times Radio. In the aftermath of the Second World War, superpowers were often defined by their arsenals, the cornerstone piece being the aircraft carrier. But what role do aircraft carriers play in the 21st century? Geopolitics and warfare, and are they even necessary? The development of hypersonic and ballistic anti-ship missiles and the emergence of sea drones and their success in sinking much of Putin's Black Sea fleet present a new threat to traditional naval capabilities and could have got the best of the expensive and resource-consuming aircraft carriers. Regardless, nations from well-established superpowers to emerging military actors continue to plan their navies around the carrier and its unrivaled capability to project power both physically and politically. So, what is the future of the aircraft carrier? Well, to answer that question, joining me today is Dr. Sidharth Kaushal, Senior Research Fellow on Sea Power at RUSI here in London, and Vice Admiral Jerry Kidd, former Fleet Commander and now Lieutenant Governor of Jersey. Thank you both for joining me this morning. Now, just first up, undoubtedly, the death of the battleship came with the emergence of the aircraft carrier and a change in the nature of sea battle to one that was conducted over greater range. But in the Cold War, the Soviets very obviously did not seek to go toe-to-toe against the US as they developed these enormous fleet carriers. So, Sidharth, am I right in saying, as I said in the introduction, that carriers have always been the hallmark of superpowers?
Yeah, and to a certain extent, although you're right that the Soviets didn't ever seek to replicate, the U.S. carrier capability, their sort of commander for the head of the Soviet Navy for much of the Cold War, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, consistently pushed for them to be able to do so because, they recognized after the Cuban Missile Crisis and really quite early on in the Cold War that the Cold War was probably not going to be fought in Europe. It wasn't going to be fought in the Fulda Gap because the risks were just too big for both superpowers. It was going to be fought at expeditionary reach. And really, in that context, naval power, and in particular, the ability to generate local air power at close proximity was something that Gorshkov regarded, correctly in my view, as critical. They did develop sort of light fleet carriers, the Kuznetsov class, but they never really got what the Soviet Navy never really got what it wanted. And that, of course, reflected the fact that it was subordinate to a army-dominated general staff. But you're right, I think it always has been the hallmark of being a global superpower rather than a regional power, which is something, even the Soviet navalists would have probably seen.
And it's been interesting that as Putin has sought to modernize the Russian military over the last 20 years, one of the areas he definitely did not seek to modernize was the aircraft carriers. Indeed, Jerry, I think when you were fleet commander, I remember the Russian carrier was making its way down the channel, belching black smoke. And you discussed with me whether or not we were going to send out a warship as an escort or a tug to assist in case it broke down. So Putin's lack of investment notwithstanding, you would argue, I'm certain, that carriers remain essential to any modern blue water navy.
Yes, absolutely, James, and many thanks for allowing me to join in this discussion today. Listen, he's right. The Russian Navy has been very centric on submarine, particularly nuclear submarine powers, and their confrontation with the West was always really underwater in the Atlantic, as I know very well. But in recent times, the Russians have become much more ambitious in the global stage, and their ambitions are now in Africa and the Far East, the Arctic, and increasingly in the Pacific. So, the aircraft carrier capability for them is deeply attractive, if at the moment too expensive, because the Russians have watched. They've recognized that having an aircraft carrier allows you to power project on the global stage like no other military asset. At the end of the day, is the capacity to deploy and sustain combat power globally is where aircraft carriers are at their zenith. And quite frankly, any navy worth its salt has at its heart, as its centerpiece, an aircraft carrier capability. And that is why so many countries remain invested in them and will continue to do so into the future.
So for viewers who haven't recognised you from the documentary that you starred in when you brought HMS Queen Elizabeth out of build, you drove a carrier twice. You drove the last of the Royal Navy's light carriers, and then you brought the first of the Queen Elizabeth class out of build. Can you just explain to our viewers what role it is that carriers play in the sea battle? Why are they so essential to achieving sea control in the modern maritime environment?
Yes, indeed. I actually commanded 2 strike carriers and also HMS Illustrious in the rotary wing helicopter role. So I've commanded carriers with different mixed air wings. But central is the aircraft carrier is not to be seen as just a ship. That's completely wrong. An aircraft carrier, particularly in the modern sense, yes, it delivers air power, and that's its fundamental job, really, is delivering striking power to strike targets ashore at range and, of course, at sea. But now we're evolving the aircraft carrier very quickly. They are a joint operating base laden with all sorts of capabilities, not just military, also intelligence services, special forces. So because they are sovereign capability and they can be deployed around the world with impunity largely, they can be loaded with capabilities that really can't be hosted by any other platform. So carriers will remain, if you like, the mothership of ambitious navies, because they are so flexible, and the fact they are sovereign, and they are not just a moving airfield, although that's our primary role. So I think what we'll see moving forward is the aircraft carrier, largely physically remaining the same, a flat deck, it moves through the water at speed, but what's in it that's the key thing.
So it's the threat is changing. I mean, the satellite surveillance is now all pervasive, so hiding these things ever harder. The Chinese are investing an enormous amount of money in hypersonic precision missiles that will contribute to an anti-access area denial capability. So Jerry's made the point very powerfully that these ships remain the sort of the foundation stone of any credible modern blue water navy. But that can't be forever. There's too much investment going into being able to defeat carriers.
Yeah. So my first observation there is that you're right. The Chinese have invested in a quite formidable anti-access area denial threat in the Asia-Pacific. And there is a sort of cost imbalance facing the carrier and its defenses in that, an anti-ship ballistic missile like the 1,500-kilometer DF-21D costs in the range of 10 million and can potentially, if it strikes a carrier, mission kill it. But I think there's a risk of drawing the wrong strong lesson from that. That therefore these relative sort of cost asymmetries mean that weaker actors will be able to asymmetrically offset carriers in general. What you need to look at the DF-21D and the DF-17, the hypersonic glide vehicle, as is part of a system for the Chinese, a system that includes 300 surveillance satellites, both electronic intelligence and synthetic aperture radar, which includes automated processing that allows for countermeasures against these satellites like spoofing and barrage jamming to be overcome, which includes the ability to coordinate other ISR methods like aircraft and vessels and fuse the data from them. And when you look at the costs of that system in aggregate rather than the missile itself, you realize that if anything, building that kind of system is even more of an exclusive superpower prerogative than building an aircraft carrier. It's really only the Chinese and the Americans who could potentially do something like that. So my first observation is, I think that case is relevant to the Pacific, but not necessarily transferable. Just to give you an example, the Russians, who tried to replace their own Soviet-era naval surveillance satellite system with new constellations of Pion and Lotos electronic intelligence and electro-optical satellites, had by the early 2020s only launched one electronic intelligence satellite and about 6 electro-optical ones. And Russia is itself a great military power. So I'd say the barriers to entry kind of preclude most states denying sea space to the aircraft carrier in the way that the Chinese can. The second point I'd make, though, is even within the specific confines of the Pacific, when we talk about the vulnerability of the carrier, we do have to ask the question relative to what. There are undoubtedly very real risks to the aircraft carrier, but there are exponentially greater risks to Kadena, which is the main US air base in the region, which is within range of the vast majority of much cheaper short-range ballistic missiles, with which the Chinese could overwhelm them. And similarly, if you look at even greater distances at Guam, one expert suggested that the cost of air and missile defense for Guam alone would cost around $5 billion, and even that would provide a temporary air defense bubble. So as much of a risk as there is to carriers, even in the Pacific, there's still probably a safer sort of platform for projecting air power than fixed air bases, which are eminently more vulnerable. Beyond the Pacific, as I said, that risk out to 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers, I suspect won't exist, or to the extent that it does, it will come from platforms like nuclear attack submarines, which are themselves expensive, valuable, and which an adversary will be loath to risk unless there's a high probability of success. But it is true, that cruise missiles are proliferating. We've seen, the Houthis, who a non-state actor, field them in the Red Sea in a way that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. The quality of Russian coastal defense batteries, like the P8, like the Bastion P, also represent a step change over Cold War or sort of predecessors. And so certainly the way in which carriers operate even outside the Pacific will change somewhat. I don't expect that what we saw in 1991, where carriers loitered in the Persian Gulf relatively close to the theater of operations to support air operations ashore, would be possible. I think there is a threat out from say 300 to 500 kilometers, even if you're not in the Pacific. But really, the robust anti-access area denial challenge, that issue of pervasive ISR, and really and effectors which have a high probability of penetrating a carrier screen, is a very regionally specific one because of those barriers to entry. It's something I'd like.
It's fascinating. Jerry, a theme that's emerged from our last couple of discussions on superpowers has been the divergence between the Euro-Atlantic theatre and the Indo-Pacific theatre. And I remember, when you were the fleet commander, the Carrier Strike Group deployed in 2021 to the Indo-Pacific and had an amazing trip and demonstrated its convening power as allies around the region came out to operate with us. But there is no doubt, exactly as just been so well set out, that the A2AD battle in the Pacific very different to the one in the Atlantic. And you can see the Queen Elizabeth class with 5th generation fighters on board posing a threat to the Kola Peninsula in the high north as a very credible challenge. but there are models that suggest that no carrier is making it across the Indian Ocean if it's on its way to fight China. So is it worth having simply for the Euro-Atlantic, or do you reject that they're being increasingly overmatched by defences in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, and I had to agree with all the points just made by my colleague. Absolutely right between the regional aspects there. No, I refute that. I think the whole beauty of an aircraft carrier is it is not in the sense a purely regional capability. I think the whole point of them is having a global flexibility to it. We have modelled, as you can imagine, every theatre to death. With aircraft carriers, carrier strike battle groups, and there's a whole number of plans, operational plans, that are designed obviously with the threat and the enemy's or potential enemy's capabilities in mind. Particularly in the PACOM area, we've worked very closely, of course, with the American Navy on this, with all the contingency, particularly around Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, and Southeast Asia. And of course, operational design for those contingency plans does take all this into account. There are a different suite of challenges, of course, in each region. And I agree with my colleague, that the suite you find in the Baltic or the high north, the Atlantic, is very different to the very concentrated, very high threat area of Southeast Asia. And I think the carrier battle groups play a different role. I wouldn't like to go into the particular specifics for security reasons, but the sophistication of approach, particularly by allies with carriers, is extremely good. And I would just push back that the sort of cliche that that carriers are vulnerable is absolutely wrong. There is probably no safer military asset to base your air power on than an aircraft carrier at sea. The very basic issues of the difficulty in targeting a ship, even in the vastness of the Atlantic and also the Western Pacific, is considerable, and they move. I think people forget the very basics, that a fixed airfield ashore can be targeted because it doesn't go anywhere and it's very large. Not only does the aircraft carrier group move, but the defensive shields around it, both from cyber, from space, from the anti-missile capability you take in your frigates and your destroyers, the up threat protection afforded by nuclear submarines and special forces, allows you to shape any battle space commensurate with the risk you're going to find there. So the sophistication of the modern battle space is significant. And we do understand the enemy's capabilities very well indeed, I have to say. So as always, it's a very, very complicated cake, and the ingredients of which are getting ever more complicated. But for my money, as an aircraft carrier officer, they still remain a centerpiece, a very sound investment in order to deliver power projection at range in a sustainable manner.
So the other thing that Sidharth touched on, which, again, I know we've had conversations about in the MOD, you mentioned the US bases in the Pacific. People talk about Cyprus and to a lesser degree Gibraltar for the UK in the Euro-Atlantic, and they call them the unsinkable aircraft carriers, which is true, right? The sort of runway Akrotiri is not being sunk, but it doesn't move either. I think that Cyprus, Gibraltar for the US, Guam, Diego Garcia clearly are of enormous strategic value, but it doesn't compensate for having a movable runway. The other thing I would observe is there's something really important about the network of alliances that come from access, basing, overflight. And so from a political perspective, sometimes the capacity to just put a carrier wherever you wish without needing to build that coalition of nations supporting your mission can actually be a problem. And the example I would use to reflect is that when the UK made its first response and first few responses to the Houthis, it did so from Cyprus, but it was really important that in doing that, there was permission from the Egyptians for overflight. And that had a sort of political value in showing that the planes transiting from Cyprus to the Red Sea were sort of going through Arab airspace with permission en route. So how do we strike the balance between the military flexibility that comes with a runway that can go wherever you want and you don't need any of those agreements versus the political advantage in securing access, area overflight, basing permissions, and therefore a coalition that says to an adversary that, it's not just you v me, it's you v all of us?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good question, and I suppose in some ways the answer is probably contextually defined. In some contexts, it may be the case that what you really want is as broad a front as possible, because the political risks of being seen as acting alone are just too great. But in other cases, the operational risk of either being denied access by an ally who perhaps doesn't want to be part of a coalition. Think of how for example, the Turkish denied the US access to Incirlik during the early days of the Iraq War, create operational vulnerabilities that simply doom a campaign to failure. There's also one other aspect of basing which might be worth noting though, which is that every time you create a base, particularly in contested territory, you also create a bit of leverage for an adversary. And the example here I'd use is how US air bases, air bases and bases more broadly in Iraq have become a sort of pressure point for Iran and the Popular Mobilization Forces that act as its proxies. So there is a bit of a trade-off between agility and coalition building, which, it's in some ways it's a political rather than a military principle. And the question of which you prioritize, I suppose, is contextually defined.
Jerry,
James, can I come in on that one?
Sorry, go, please.
Yeah, James, a good example, I have to say, on this. I take your point about, building out allied cohesion. But I think we must be really careful here to recognize that sovereign nature and the fact that an aircraft carrier is a sovereign capability that can be switched on very quickly. I remember back in 2014 when ISIS were making their moves to expand their caliphate, and the Allies decided that action had to be taken to stop it. And I always remember that all our air bases in the Middle East, it took 52 or 54 days to get diplomatic agreement to allow our aircraft based ashore to be used in that fight. But the USS George H.W. Bush in the Gulf was flying its first mission within 4 hours. So the first 4.5, 5 weeks of combat attacks against ISIS, against that terrorist group, was purely by aircraft carriers. And it is that political expediency, that flexibility of choice that aircraft gives the political class. So they're an extremely agile capability, and they pack one hell of a punch. And of course, they can move 600 miles a day. So they can switch in and out of theatre very quickly and be reinforced quickly. But ultimately, they give politicians an immediacy that may be denied where you're dependent on other diplomatic engagements.
So I quite agree. And I think there's a conversation to be had about the utility of aircraft carriers in a peer-on-peer war and sort of what the trade-offs are there. But when you know that you are against a non-peer adversary, the sort of raw gunboat diplomacy of just parking a carrier off the coast and making a statement is enormous. I, as the Minister for the Armed Forces, actually was on record as saying that I felt we should have sailed one of the UK carriers to the southern Red Sea when the Houthi threat emerged. Others around the UK system disagreed. I dare say if you'd still been Fleet Commander, I would have had a battle buddy in that cause, because that felt like exactly the moment that we have these carriers for. They really do make a statement, and they're incredibly capable too.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's not just about the effect. We always think about the effect on the enemy of sailing a carrier or something very powerful that can reach out and touch the bad guys ashore. But, it is about sending a message to allies too, that we mean business. And I think this is where aircraft carriers fundamentally have a currency all of their own, because they are so visible. I mean, by their nature, they're big, they're grand, they go around with a carrier strike group, so they are very heavyweight. And we can come on to costs later. But the bottom line is, my word, for a nation state to sail a carrier, I think it reassures allies, it shows that you mean business, and it can galvanize and be enzymatic on the international stage to make a very big political statement in its own right. So, they're not just a military instrument. They bring just an unquantifiable effect across the whole diplomatic political spectrum.
So let's move on to exactly that, the industrial, technological competition, sort of the capabilities themselves. China is investing heavily in a carrier strike capability. Do you know much of the Chinese plan? Are they intending to match the US in having 10 fleet carriers versus the US's 10, or what's the plan there?
Yeah, so I think the Chinese have been quite cautious and incremental in how they've approached their carrier program, partially reflecting the inherent complexity of aircraft carriers as well as the enabling capabilities that make them useful in the first place, but partially because they recognize that their immediate goals are in the first island chain in the Indo-Pacific, and that to some extent attenuates the requirement for carriers. That being said, there are two sets of objectives, well, three really, that really incentivize the adoption of aircraft carriers for the Chinese. The first is actually within the first island chain. We're actually looking at quite a substantial area of space, right? The South China Sea is analogous in size to the Mediterranean. The nearest Chinese air bases are 1,200 kilometers away. So in many ways, power projection in China's region has an almost expeditionary quality given the sheer scale of that region. The second aim for which aircraft carriers are quite useful for the Chinese is what their military theorists call forward edge defense. So it's the idea that, in the event of a local crisis in the Indo-Pacific, it is attendant on the PLA to slow down the deployment of the US capabilities to the immediate environs of the first island chain. And obviously, anti-access capabilities like the DF-21D might be one way of achieving that, but a carrier strike group that is beyond the first island chain will inevitably tie up in the early days of a crisis or a conflict a number of American assets to track or engage this. And this has a disruptive knock-on effect on all American plans to deploy to the first island chain. So paradoxically, the carriers in this context are a sort of fleet in being for the more sort of locally oriented force of green water vessels and ground-based aircraft and everything else that supports Chinese objectives in the first island chain. And then the final sort of reason they might pursue carriers, of course, is the Indian Ocean, because their sea lines of communication are straddled by, choke points like Malacca, which has traditionally been a concern for the Chinese. And overcoming this dilemma is something they can achieve with a degree of local preponderance, certainly potentially vis-a-vis the Indian Navy in the foreseeable future, but perhaps in due course they would aspire to doing so vis-a-vis the US Navy as well. The approach in programmatic terms has been quite cautious. So they bought essentially an old Soviet light carrier from the Ukrainians in the mid-2000s, refurbished it, and of course it became the Liaoning, the Type 001, China's first carrier. Now, this was not necessarily treated as a critical combat capability, but it was very useful for training the first generation of PLA naval aviators. With China's first Katobar-equipped carrier, which has reached initial operational capability this year, however, the Fujian, what we're seeing is the gradual evolution towards a full-scale carrier strike capability. In tactical terms, I think the Chinese view carriers slightly differently than we do in one respect, which is that the carrier is the centerpiece of a much larger group of surface escorts that would normally accompany a Western carrier, including 1 to 2 Type 55 cruisers, as well as 1 to 2 Type 52 destroyers, and then several sort of frigates. And the vertical launch cell capacity and the anti-ship cruise missile capacity on these cruisers and destroyers generally exceeds that of an Arleigh Burke or a Ticonderoga class. So in some ways, the carrier might act as fleet air protection for a very VLS-centric sort of surface fleet, rather than the way we think about it, which is the other way around. The surface escorts protect the carriers. So there's a slight difference in perhaps the tactical modalities there, which is worth examining. But broadly speaking, I think the strategic function it plays for the Chinese is similar. In terms of where they might go, in terms of to your question about numbers, I think the aspiration they've laid out is to have 6 carrier battle groups over the course of time, which is comparable to, though not equal to, the United States. The challenges they're going to face, though, is there are still certain technological bottlenecks facing them. So, scaling the production of WS-19 turbofan engines for their next generation of carrier-borne aircraft is something they're still struggling to do. They also haven't yet fielded a credible airborne early warning capability for the Catabar-equipped carriers. And anti-submarine warfare is at reach, is still an area where they struggle. So I think building the institutional capacity to support a large number of carrier strike groups in a way that makes them combat credible is still something they are working around. And I think they, to some degree, recognize this, which is why there's been quite an ambitious but nonetheless very incremental approach to building a carrier strike capability.
Really interesting to hear a theme that I know has been emerging in the land domain, that the kind of the fighting arms, the infantry and the cavalry are there to protect the specialists. That in modern warfare, that's the way. Incredible to see that inversion in the maritime domain too, Jerry. That you, as the carrier, the captain of the fleet's flagship, are there to defend your destroyer captains. But I see a lot of logic in what was said there. That the real battle is these long-range, hypersonic precision fires, and that actually being able to control the sea space within which those cruisers and destroyers that have that capability embarked is a really important maritime naval function. Do you subscribe to that vision of the future of the naval battle? Because if so, you can see how the shape of navies changes quite quickly as a consequence.
Yes, I agree. I mean, let's go back 100 years to the genesis of the aircraft carrier in the round. People may notice that the pennant number of all Royal Naval aircraft carriers start with the letter R. And people say, well, shouldn't it be C for carrier? Well, no, we have C for cruisers, but D for destroyers, F for frigates. And aircraft carriers were R because it meant reconnaissance. They were just there to provide aircraft to go up threat and spot the enemy, to allow battleships to fire their big guns, their 15 and 16-inch guns against the enemy. So the aircraft carriers were literally an ISR platform, if you like, to spot the enemy. And then, of course, they become much more central as a strike asset in their own right, based on aircraft and the missiles that aircraft carry. So I do subscribe that the evolution of the carrier may well go back a bit, and where the carrier becomes this sort of, if you like, this protective base from which to allow other ships to launch missiles and whatever they're carrying. But I do think that's a bit simplistic. I think the advent of drones and robotics, I foresee in the next 20 or 30 years, particularly Iran, definitely China, and maybe other countries developing quite quickly robotic air wings, which we've talked about for a long time. Doctrinally, the West, the Americans, the British, have always seen manned fixed-wing aircraft as the sort of the centrality of an aircraft carrier air wing. That's going to shift, in my view, very quickly. And I think absolutely, ultimately, we may get a robotic aircraft carrier, big deck floating with very few humans on it, but able to call drones forward to provide an envelope around the fleet that's moving several hundred miles a day. So we will see. But I know that whatever happens, the aircraft carrier or air system carrier will be around for a long time yet.
So I, as a minister, my challenge was always to sort of make sure the taxpayers were getting the best value for their money, and that we weren't just buying stuff out of habit, or even worse, out of kind of hubris. If Elon Musk can bring a rocket back from space and land it vertically on a barge in the middle of the ocean, why isn't the future of carrier strike, instead of one capital ship, 6 or 7 floating barge platforms with drone wings embarked on each, connected to a network of missile barges, connected to sensors in space and in the air? Why is it not that network of dispersed smaller points of presence drawing on automation instead of $5 billion destroyer surrounded by $2 billion cruisers and $5 billion carrier surrounded by $2 billion cruisers and destroyers? If the fight in 2030 with China is 1 million tons of carrier against 1 million tons of carrier, are we missing the opportunity to be the disruptor, to be the insurgent? I'm going to come to Jerry first, then to Chief Steph.
Yeah, I mean, really good point, James. And I think that we must always remember that we are sort of shackled to our history in many ways. Combat power is an amalgam of 3 things. There's the physical, there's the doctrinal, and then there's the moral. Physical is about having the right equipment, as you say, whether it's carriers, tanks, or aircraft. The second one is moral componency, the will to fight, as we're seeing with the Ukrainians right now. But the third one is doctrinal, if you like, the instruction booklet of how to wield your combat power. And it's not, there's lots and lots of papers out there about the future war and the future battle space and the nature of war and all that sort of thing. It's all very, very good to write down. But when it actually comes to putting it into operational and tactical plans, is much, much more difficult. These are generational capabilities that take many, many years to renew, to refresh. And we saw my colleague there talking about the very cautious way the Chinese Navy have brought aircraft carriers into their order of battle. In fact, I visited Liaoning as the first Western officer. I was invited on Liaoning when she first came out of the yard. A very impressive ship too. But clearly, he didn't really understand how to operate an air wing at the time, and they've gone very slowly. So, to switch to a dispersive, doctrinal fight, maritime or battle is going to be really challenging. I don't disagree with you, James. I think things will change, and I think a lot is stored on network capabilities. But I tell you now, in the next war, the one thing that will be attacked and will be very vulnerable will be networks, especially with the advent of quantum and AI. I think we'll hark back to flashing light. We'll be harking back to flags. We'll be harking back to navigating by sextants because GPS will be jammed. So we're moving so much into a much more confrontational environment just through the EM spectrum as well as physical, that every facet of a maritime capability will be affected. So it's a very, very complicated question. It's very simple to make great predictions, but I think fundamentally things will move slower than people expect.
See, that's a great point. That's why, as a minister, you rely on 3-star admirals to come in and tell you you're talking nonsense, because that is so true. There I am. My vision, drawing on all the technologies of automation and everything Elon's learned from landing rockets on barges, all relies on complete freedom of communication. All the satellites are in place, all the networks exist. In reality, first phase of any peer-on-peer war is probably an attack against all of those satellite capabilities that provide the comms to allow dispersal to work. So is Jerry right that fundamentally we're going to end up back in a battle much more like we would have seen in the 70s and 80s, rather than the one that we think we're capable of given today's technologies?
I think, yeah, I'd concur with that. And I suppose the only addition I'd make to what Jerry and my colleague said is that there's also a trade-off between logistical efficiency and, or rather, that logistical efficiency drives concentration. So, you can do the things that a carrier does right now with lighter, cheaper vessels. For example, the America-class LHAs, the helicopter carriers, can launch an F-35. But the number of munitions you can store, the systems to load those munitions rapidly, those things have to be sacrificed if you're using a smaller vessel. And so your sortie rate necessarily suffers. So the more you want, the more efficiency efficiency you want in terms of consolidating your logistical chain, the more that drives consolidation. I think the conversation about distributed lethality is a very relevant one. But where I think it's going to be most relevant is where you don't need to maintain steady state power. So an aircraft carrier, has to launch sortie after sortie ashore. In the counter-ISIS campaign, American carriers were launching 100 sorties a day at some point. Where I think distribution will be most useful is when you want a single pulse of power. So, for example, small missile-equipped vessels, which can be networked, mindful of the disruption that's been discussed, can launch convergent attacks against a target, at which point they've emptied their load out of VLS and they've either achieved their objective or not. When you're looking at those sort of temporally bounded sort of pulses of effect, distribution has real utility. But when you need steady state effect, which is fundamentally what air power provides, in addition to all the challenges of network disruption that my colleague discussed, the logistical demands of that, I think, still drive a consolidation.
What a fascinating conversation. I hope, as a light infantryman, I've not been exposed for my lack of naval knowledge. I've learned an enormous amount. You've been watching Superpowers on Times Radio with me, James Heappey. Thank you to my guests, Dr. Sidharth Kaushal and Vice Admiral Jerry Kidd. If you want to hear the latest about the future of defence, history and global security, you can watch Superpowers on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.